Hey everybody, my name is Bryce Young. I'm the president and founder of Warm Audio. I'm here today in our Warm Studios, and I want to talk to you about our WA76. So what are some of the things that people like about an 1176 style compressor? They like that they're fast, that they're fairly transparent. They do have their own little magic and tone, but they give you a very upfront, in-your-face sound. Some examples would be a kick drum, a snare drum, a vocalist that's getting really aggressive, a guitar. I think of an acoustic where sometimes they can kind of pump as you're strumming. This compressor won't let any of that through if you choose to have a fast attack time. Here at Warm Studios, we find a lot of people using the WA76 on bass guitar as well, as it gives you a very constant, consistent bass tone that doesn't jump in and out of the mix. One thing that I'm really proud of about this product's performance, and you'll notice with some compressors, the more you compress, the more it starts to affect the frequency response. And so on some compressors, you might see, as you compress really deeply, oh, I'm losing some treble, or I'm losing a little bit of bass. What's fascinating is even at 20 dB of compression on the WA76, it's flat all the way down to 15 hertz. It's just an unbelievable frequency response. It's not going to shape or affect the tone of your recording. In fact, it's just going to give you really exactly what came in, but controlled on the way out. It's one thing to build a product that looks similar to a classic. It's another thing to care so much about the quality and the build to say, hey, we're not scared. Put this up against any other 1176 style compressor on the market and see what you think. And that's what I wanted to do with this back in 2014 when it was developed. When I brought this idea up to the owner of CineMag, he got really excited. His name's David Gearin, and he just loves the history of all this stuff, I think as we all do. And he told me a story. So his business partner that founded CineMag with him was Ed Reichenbach's son. And who's Ed Reichenbach? So Ed Reichenbach founded a company called Reichenbach Engineering, and they made transformers for Altec, Lansing, API, all kinds of brands in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And they actually designed, Reichenbach Engineering designed the very first output transformer used in the 1176 style compressor, which is a pretty neat piece of history. And he had all the documentation to get that exactly right. Now, that's exciting, but he also worked with us to build a great input transformer that had lower noise than the original, had a better frequency response. So actually, in a lot of ways, feels that our WA76 performs better than some of the very old relics that are really expensive and hard to get anyway. Why is the WA76 called an FET compressor? It's called that because the component in the compressor that's performing most of the compression is an FET. It's an FET transistor, and FET stands for field effect transistor. I love the sound and warmth of tubes, but there's times where an FET compressor just does the job. A couple examples would be if you're using a microphone that already has a lot of character, let's say. Let's say it's the WA47. It's based on the classic U47. You've got a lot of character. Maybe it's even hitting a 73 style mic pre like the WA73. And it already sounds really warm and full of character. You need to control the dynamics of the recording, but you don't want to add any more character or color. That's when I would reach for the WA76. I think any of us that want an 1176 style compressor in our studio, we want to know that it is as authentic as it possibly can be. And that's something that I want to address because a lot of people ask, is it identical to the very first one or the original? And what I say is it's as close as it can be. And let's talk about that a little bit. So first of all, there are components that are no longer made. I brought up earlier that the original Reichenbach Engineering output transformer is what ours is designed after. And CineMag is giving us the closest variant of that today. But if we wanted to call up Reichenbach Engineering and Ed Reichenbach, he's no longer around and that's no longer being made. So there are some components that we have to find and source and make custom. There are some things though that we definitely want to keep as close as possible. So a couple other things that we did in the WA76 to keep it as authentic as possible to the original is, I'd say the first one would be the type of construction. So this product, the WA76, is put together by hand. It's it's through-hole assembly. And what does that mean? So what that means is that each component is put onto the PCB, and ends of the components actually go through the holes of the PCB and are then soldered to the PCB. And this is very different than a lot of modern assembly. A lot of modern assembly looks like how maybe an iPhone or a motherboard might look when you open it up. Lots of little components that are put very quickly by a machine onto a PCB. The reason why we feel keeping the WA76 authentic in the way it's constructed is important is when you start changing the construction type, you then might be forced to choose components that are only of a modern type or a modern make. So a couple examples is we use tantalum capacitors in the WA76. I felt like these capacitors gave it a really warm sound, and they were authentic to what we found in some vintage 1176 style compressors. Another thing that we've done with the WA76 to keep it authentic is to keep the signal path fully discrete. Now that is a buzzword that's thrown around a lot, and I want to make sure I define that a little bit. So discrete circuitry is circuitry that is not using semiconductors or chips in the signal path of the audio. Semiconductors, aka chips, are a pretty important type of component in a lot of modern electronics, and I definitely don't want to say that they're bad in any way. When they came out in the 70s or became big in the 70s, they were sort of thought of as an opportunity to make circuits simpler. It's like, hey, those 5 transistors, those 5 resistors, and those 5 capacitors do something in a circuit. We can replace all of that with a chip. It's easier. Well, with making something easier, the sound wasn't always better. And so a lot of chips, especially back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, really did not perform as well as discrete circuitry. For the 1176 or the WA76 to have that tone and that sound that we all expect from the 76, we absolutely did not want any non-discrete components or chips in the circuit. So I now want to talk about the features on the WA76 and give you a little bit of information about how it works. So first of all, it's a line level device. And what does that mean? It means that you can't connect things that have a low level output to it. So let me give you some examples. A bass guitar, a electric guitar, a microphone can't connect directly to the WA76. You'll need to send those into a preamp first. And what some people do is they'll send those instrument level signals or mic level signals into a interface first, and then from there run it back out into the WA76. What I prefer to do is hit an outboard preamp, and Warm Audio makes several types of outboard preamps, but that way you can connect the instrument or the microphone directly to the preamp, then turn that preamp gain up so you're sending a strong line level signal into the WA76. Now the input pot here on the front controls the amount of signal that hits the threshold. What is a threshold? So the threshold is the part of the circuitry that decides that the signal will start compressing. So let's pretend that this hand is the threshold and this hand is the signal coming into the unit. As you turn up that input pot, boop, all of a sudden it will hit the threshold and compression will start being applied. If the meter here is set to gain reduction mode, as you're turning up that input signal, all of a sudden that needle will start moving to the left as it's compressing peaks in the audio. Now the output pot here controls makeup gain. So after you've applied a good amount of compression to the audio signal, you're going to need to increase the amount of level leaving the WA76 so it can hit your DAW or your tape recorder if you're still recording to tape with enough gain. Now the attack pot. What the attack does is decides how quickly the compression will be applied after the signal hits that threshold. And the attack has a pretty big range. So it's actually from 20 microseconds all the way to 800 microseconds in its slowest setting. Now below the attack pot, we have a release pot. And what that does is it controls how quickly the compression stops being applied to the signal after the signal falls below the threshold. There's a pretty good range in this release pot here from 50 to 1100 milliseconds. And in the really fast setting, you can create kind of a pumping sound if you want that, depending on how heavy the compression is being applied, because it will release very, very quickly. Basically, as soon as that audio signal drops below the threshold, it releases. And so there can be some cool effects that you create by messing with the attack and release. I know a lot of people are just trying to seek the most natural sound. One place to start for that, I think we get that question asked a lot, is where should I start? Where should the knobs be when I begin? Is what we call the Dr. Pepper settings. And so that would be, I think, at 10 and 2. So you'd be a fairly slow, medium to slow attack with a fairly fast release. And I oftentimes start here when I begin compression because it's a great starting point. So here we've got the meter switch, and this just controls what you're seeing on the meter. So most people are going to use this with GR Preston, stands for gain reduction. It's going to show you how much compression is being applied. As the needle will move to the left, that number that you see on the VU will show you roughly how much compression is being applied to the signal. Now in the +8 setting, what this is doing is showing you that when the needle hits 0, you're receiving a +8 signal on the output XLR jack, or the output. And +4 means that when the needle is at 0, you're getting a +4 signal at the output. And then this simple one, off, that's how you shut it off when you're done. Let me talk about the ratio switches next. So the ratio is how much compression will be applied to the signal after it hits the threshold, and how much signal will be allowed to go past the threshold. With a compressor, it's not an exact limiter. So if you think of my hand as a limiter literally limits and stops any signal from getting above the threshold. Well, compressor allows a little bit to go above, and that's what gives it a natural sound. So in 4-to-1, if 4 dB goes past, hits the threshold, the compressor will allow 1 dB through. In 8-to-1, a full 8 dB have to hit the threshold before it will allow even 1 to go through. So the compression gets harder as you go up in numbers. One thing about the ratio switch that I find really interesting, I think a lot of people do, is that there was a little bit of a happy accident in the design. What it is these switches were meant to be pressed individually. As you see, I'm pressing here. But people that used this style of compressor learned you could press multiples at once. So as you see here, I'm holding down 2 at once here, 2 at once. And doing this creates different compression ratios. And so we encourage you to experiment with it. You're not going to break the compressor. It's not going to hurt anything. The one that's become most famous is the all buttons in mode, which is where you press all 4 at the same time. They lock into place. And this is known to create a very hard limiting sound. It even adds some distortion. And if you compress heavy, it will be obvious and blatant distortion. Where I've seen this used most often is on drums. So people will take a pair of 2 WA76s, they'll go to all buttons in mode, they'll send their drum bus into these, they'll compress pretty heavy, they'll create a cool, pumping, really aggressive, distorted drum sound, and then they'll take the clean drum mix and mix it together, and just deciding on how aggressive they want their drums to sound will be how they create that mix. All right, so let's talk about the backside and the features that are here. So starting in the top left, we've got the voltage selector switch. You shouldn't technically ever need to touch that unless you're moving countries. So in the United States, the voltage that comes out of the wall is roughly around 115, 120 volts. So you see here, this one's set to 115. In some countries, that'll be flipped and switched to another, but you typically don't want to mess with that. If you're, for example, in Europe, where there's 230 volts, 220 volts coming out of the wall, if you have that set at 115, you're going to actually burn up the electronics inside. So definitely, that is to be left alone, and hopefully should be set properly from the retailer you buy in your territory. Here we've got the IEC inlet, so that's how the power from the wall comes in. You've got the fuse is accessible right below it. And I want to talk about for a second, I know a lot of products have moved to external DC wall wart type power supplies. There's nothing wrong with those. We have no issues with those. We do, though, understand the value of having clean cabling behind your rack. Maybe you're using this mobily and don't want a bunch of wall warts moving around in your rack. So we do whatever we can to make products with an internal power supply. Then we go over here, we've got the balanced output. So this is where the signal will leave the unit. You can use the TRS or the XLR output. They are actually soldered or summed together. So you could, in theory, I guess, use both jacks, but it would just be like using a splitter cable here on the output, and it could affect your tone. So we recommend usually just to use one or the other, and it's just there for convenience. You might only have one TRS cable left in the studio. You don't have another XLR. Great, you don't have to go and buy a different cable. You've got the same thing for the input here. So the balanced input has a TRS input or a line level XLR. Once again, that's not a mic level XLR. On the back here, we've got 2 more features. So the pad, this is rarely used, and we typically recommend to leave it pushed out. And what that is if you have a very hot output from, let's say, a preamp with a lot of gain, and you don't want it to hit the compressor so hard, so quickly, you can engage this pad. That would just be user preference, but we recommend to start with it out and go from there. And the meter adjust here. So this adjusts the meter, as I showed you on the front, when you have gain reduction selected on the meter selector, the needle should be resting right at 0. There will be times, maybe after a lot of use, it's been warmed up for a while, maybe it'll take months, that needle could rest slightly off of 0. Some people don't care, some people, they want it dead on 0. And in that case, you could get out a little small screwdriver, look at the front while you're doing it, and adjust that to sit right on 0. Thank you for taking a moment to learn about the WA76 with me today. You can read up more about it at warmaudio.com/WA76. And we've got photographs of the insides, we've got component explanations all on the website. Definitely encourage you to check it out. We're very proud of what's inside, and that's why we do what we do. So thanks again and take care.